in which 300 Jews were saved over a period of an entire month. About 700 other people after the Jewish rescue operation, a combination of the ever-increasing numbers of Danish resistance fighters, and also Allied airmen, bomber crews, fighter pilots whose planes were too badly damaged in raids over Germany to make it back to base and found themselves either by virtue of crashing or parachuting onto Danish soil. The boat was built back in 1926 for the Danish Lighthouse and Buoy Service, which was at the time a part of the Danish Navy. And its job was bringing supplies and frequent crew changes to a large lighthouse where the Baltic narrows down to the Øresund, the narrow waters, the strait between Denmark and Sweden. And this and maintaining floating navigation aids, much larger versions like that green can out there, was its occupation for 60 years, manned by a 4-man crew. And it was an occupation which, during the World War II years, when Denmark was occupied for 5 years, gave it a great cover story for its clandestine crossings, with people jammed into the cargo hold, and a source of fuel and paychecks for the crew and other things that put it in a particularly good position to rescue people. And it did a particularly good job of it. Few boats went out every day during the month-long rescue. The Jewish rescue started earlier, persisted later. We're going to hear more inside about the first 3.5 years of occupation before the heroics of the rescue, which is so important because that's the period in which, while horrors were unfolding everywhere around Denmark, and picture Denmark abutting only Nazi Germany, managed to say, can't keep your troops out, can't keep your Navy ships from our shore, but we can keep your anti-Semitic programs from crossing the border. At least they were able to do that for 3.5 years. And because they were able to do that for 3.5 years, it was a large factor in enabling a period of icy coexistence. The Danes hated that the Nazis were there. But as long as they were able to maintain basic freedoms for their people, let the Nazis do their things in terms of fortifying the coast and getting a share of some industry and some agriculture, they were able to somehow live while hoping the rest of the world would take care of defeating the Nazis for good. But this notion, this kind of pact that they had at the time of the invasion, when truce was entered into, that let Denmark stay in charge of its internal affairs, keep the individual rights of its people, protect the Jews from persecution. Under Hitler, that was clearly going to have a shelf life. And the ability of Danes to tolerate Nazi forces was going to have a shelf life. And so after as you get into 3.5 years, things began to collapse quickly in this kind of icy coexistence kind of world. Partly because the Nazis were putting increased pressure on Denmark to finally address the Jews. Hitler, by this point, had purged Jews from so much else of occupied Europe. Now it was Denmark, more than anything else, standing in the way of his dream of a Jew-free Europe, and he was not going to let that happen. So pressure ramped up, resistance and resentment in Denmark ramped up. In August of '43, one of the very early resistance groups had a sabotage attack on what was then the largest exhibition hall in Scandinavia, but scheduled to become barracks for another 200 German troops the next day, blew it to smithereens. And with that, this whole notion of coexistence was blown up with it. Nazis imposed martial law, moved to take over the few military installations that Denmark was able to at least keep people in without being able to do very much with them. One of the things attacked in the course of that was the Royal Dockyards, old port of the Danish Navy going back to the 1600s. As the dockyards were invaded. It was, I believe, starting at something like 4 a.m. The Danes on board the ships at the base carried out standing orders that they had, not for the if, but for the when that would happen. And their standing orders were, if you could get your vessels to Sweden, head to Sweden. If not, blow them up at the docks, put them on the bottom, don't let them fall into Nazi hands. So I believe the tally was 29 ships put to the bottom right there at their docks. 13 vessels, I think, made it to Sweden. 2 were scuttled at sea. In the aftermath of all this, martial law was declared. Hitler ordered a plan to round up the Danish Jews, all of which was supposed to happen over a single night, Friday, Sabbath night, during the high holy days. And unquestionably, in any other place, it would have happened as planned. In Denmark, it fell apart almost instantly. And the falling apart process began with an interesting source. It began with a civilian member of the German occupation staff named Gerda III, who's part of all this. He was a harbor commissioner in Copenhagen for the occupation. His part was to find a place to dock 2 troop ships that weren't bringing more troops in, but were sent to take all the Jews out. He tried going up the chain of command, pointing out what others pointed out before, that Denmark is not like the rest of Europe, that there will be a rebellion worse than your worst nightmare, Berlin. This can't possibly be worth it. But for Hitler, apparently it was, and he got no traction going up. Faced with that, 72 hours before this roundup was to take place, he went to see the leader of one of Denmark's leading political parties, Hans Hedtoft, told him what was going to unfold in 72 hours, parted with the words, I hope you could use this information to save a lot of lives, walked off and left it to the Danes to handle it from there. Well, the word went out from Hedtoft to some predictable sources. He immediately communicated it to Rabbi Melchior, rabbi of the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen, who the next morning at services preceding that night's start of Rosh Hashanah told his congregation, today, no services. You have to go home. You have to pack some belongings. You have to warn as many people as you can of what I've been informed about, that the Nazis are going to come for us. And by tonight, we must all be in hiding. But every other conceivable source, and some virtually inconceivable, were used too. From the party apparatus, word went out from business owners to employees, union leaders to members, teachers to students. Colleges suspended classes so that students could go out, spread the word, and actually help people find hiding places. And when the raids finally came, not only did the Gestapo not capture the nearly 8,000 people that they had sought, but they had to settle that night for 200, mostly elderly Jewish people who were living in Copenhagen, and another 80 scattered throughout Denmark. Everybody else, through this large-scale national effort, had been warned and assisted in finding temporary shelter. But people knew in Denmark it was only going to be temporary. There were no long-term places to hide. And where could you hide? Well, you had to look from Copenhagen about 14 miles across the strait to Sweden, the only unoccupied place that you could reach by boat in under 450 miles, the only place that was really even a possibility. And so people turned almost immediately to the question, how do we get them there? And if you were looking at what ensued from a satellite from high above an airplane down at the coast, you would see what looked like a magnificently orchestrated rescue effort. Because within a day, some 300 boats joined the effort to get people on board, bring them across, get them to safety, come back, and get more. Some were only in a position to make a single trip. Very few were in a position to go every single day for the month that it took to get everybody out who had not been captured. Everybody out, meaning by the Swedish count, because nobody could take time to count on the Danish shore, 7,742 Jews, another 850 loved ones above their face. So this seemingly well-orchestrated centrally directed event was really nothing of the kind. There was 300 individual efforts by boats and equal or greater number by rescue groups, all responding to the same impulse, the same feeling in their gut that we can't sit by and let this happen, we have to spring into action. Here, you had a boat that already did some rescue work. In that first 3.5 years when there wasn't much resistance work, there was a small resistance group in the fishing village where this was based in peacetime, one that looks to the English reader like Dragor, but sounds today more like Drawar. They're two sons of the lighthouse keeper, the lighthouse as this boat served, formed one of the first resistance groups. And occasionally they had to get somebody out because the Nazis had somehow found out about their activities. And they would turn to Gerda to take them at that point just as far as the lighthouse, which was still kind of a safe house at sea. And there they'd await colleagues to come on board, take them the rest of the way, colleagues from Sweden who could then complete the passage. Well, the crew wasn't going to sit by when the need for the Jewish rescue arose. They worked out plans, routes that they thought might be least dangerous, but they couldn't do it on their own. Even though they were one of the only boats, maybe the only boat at the time, that already did some rescue work, being a lifeboat for everybody who is now being hunted by the Nazis was a whole different thing. So many more people, so many more trips had to be taken. The boat was now based at the Royal Dockyard, surrounded no longer by Danish vessels, but by Nazi warships. They had to get the approval of their commanding officer to at least tacitly approve putting themselves, the boat, and the whole service at risk. They had to move the boat to a place where it was more feasible to get people on board. They had to figure out how do we make contact with everybody who's now already in hiding. For all of this, they turned to a young woman named Henny, 22, incredible young woman. They asked for her help. She was in a position to be helpful. She was an employee of the lighthouse and buoy service. Equally or more significant, her father was a Danish Navy officer who commanded it. So after work, at the very start of this, they had her come on board, join them in the crew quarters, come forward, told them what they had planned, asked for her help, and she threw herself in completely. Almost immediately, the vessel was repositioned to a neighborhood called Christianshavn, and Copenhagen is kind of a long, narrow harbor with the core of the city on one side and this other Christianshavn neighborhood on the other, warehouses lining a good bit of the shore. And this was, among other things, Henny's hometown. She got this position with the help of her father behind a warehouse, where she knew the warehouse owners would see things as they did. The warehouse owners allowed the dockage. They also allowed her to hide as many people each night in their loft, the attic space, as they could fit aboard the next day. She had homeowners in the area who would let people stay in their homes for longer until they were able to make those next jumps to the warehouse and then finally to the boat. And then there's still the question, we have this great organization, how does anybody know we're here? Well, here's some good fortune intervened. At about the time that all this was unfolding, Henny was just on the cusp of forming a relationship with a young Navy cadet, Eric Koch Nicholson, next to all of his friends, and he in turn was in the process of joining forces with this student resistance group, a college resistance group. It was mainly of medical students, and they were perfect partners on shore. Perfect because as medical students, they were deeply involved in a large hospital complex in Copenhagen that spread the word, Jews, reach our hospital, enter through this chapel, come through the tunnels for other buildings. We'll hide you here. We'll put you first in patient beds with fictitious names and charts. And when those filled, as they did early, we'll put you in staff quarters while our doctors work on matching you with rescue boats, and even used their ambulances to help transport people to rendezvous points. And these students who had been involved in underground press until then were also closely tied to a bookstore in Copenhagen that then became another organizing center. If people could reach the bookstore, they would do much like the hospital was doing, match them with boats, find a way to get there. Well, There was no doubt in their minds that they were going to be a part of this, even though there were a number of things that made clear this was a dangerous pursuit. And the very first day of the rescue operation, a vessel leaving a port north of Copenhagen, Veisz, came under fire as it was leaving. The boat was perforated with bullets. The crew, the 19 Jews on board, jumped overboard, swam ashore, and were apprehended. Slightly further down the coast, 8 fishing boats left a fishing village called Snekkersten, successfully brought their Jewish passengers to Sweden, but came back and were apprehended. Their boats were confiscated. They were sent to a Nazi prison where another prisoner reported on their brutal treatment. Part of the learning curve. They came back at the height of herring season with dry nets and empty fish holds, and that could be explained away. Off Drower, where this was based in peacetime years, well, first of all, in Drower, a group of Jews heading for boats there that were ready to take them across, found Nazi vehicles, military vehicles descending on them, and instead of going onto the boats, had to run into the alleyways and find shelter in people's homes until they could leave on a later date, while another boat right offshore hit a mine and exploded. And back in Gilleleie, where people who were streaming to that harbor didn't know what had happened, that the harbor was now effectively closed off, townspeople sought to protect the Jews seeking refuge by hiding them in a church loft. With 80 of them up there, somebody, in one of the rare instances of somebody siding with the wrong side, revealed their presence, and in one raid late at night, Nazis surrounded the church. 80 people were captured and began their transit to the camps. One of them, a teenager who had already escaped from Germany to Denmark, managed to jump out of the military vehicle that was transporting him. As he was running away, a Danish taxi driver, seeing what was happening, swept by to scoop him up, bring him to a hospital, and he ultimately escaped on this vessel right in front of you. So, against that backdrop, against the clear danger of doing something to thwart Hitler's major objective for the country, they swung into action. Each morning, Henny would be given lists through this student group. Here's today's rendezvous points. Here's when you have to be there. Here's who you're going to meet, and each point would be no more than 2 people at any one time, often a mother and a young child. None of this could be in writing, so it all had to be memorized. She'd make her rounds of Copenhagen, bringing people first to the houses, and then each night before another transit, she'd meet with the crew, find out how many people could be fit aboard the next day, and that would be variable because the cargo hold still had a lot of cargo for the lighthouse, and it had to bring it because the lighthouse was now also a German observation post, and it could not show up. Typically it was 10, 15 people that they could fit, and at 1 in the morning, with a curfew in place that itself made it dangerous to be outside, then he would make the rounds, bring one person at a time up to the attic of the warehouse. Children would be heavily sedated so they couldn't cry, scream, or do anything to give this away. In the attic, Henny described, she would spend the night with the refugees and the 4 crew members. There'd be food and things to drink, but everybody was far too nervous to do any of that. And so they'd simply wait out the earliest pre-dawn hours when the crew could get on board and appear to be doing anything that was part of their regular duties. And then, as Henny described it, but in detail added by 2 teenagers who escaped on this, she would bring everybody down to the first floor of the warehouse and have them line up in 2 rows just inside of a gate that faced the boat. And that would put Henny and all the people lined up behind her at about this distance from the boat, because in between was a cobblestone lane that just big enough for a truck to pass and drop things off or pick them up at a warehouse. And think of what this meant to these people in these lines who, depending on where you were in October, didn't know for days or weeks if they would ever get out of this alive. But here was a tangible sign that they would, they could, and were about to. Except there was still one more obstacle that they had overcome. Walking up and down the dock, crisscrossing right in front of Gerda, were two uniformed German soldiers. Literally crisscrossing, right here, right in front of it. They'd walk out to the end of the pier at one end, one would turn slightly around a corner, and then they'd come back. And for the crew, it was a question of when do we reach the point of lowest risk, knowing it's still great. And when the point came, when it was as good as it was going to get, they would signal to Henny, and Henny would propel the next person out towards the boat, because this was no time to have a discussion, no time to think, we're going to be better off 10 minutes late. It had to be that second. And they propel the person to run across the cobblestone lane. A crew member would grab them up, deposit them into the cargo hold, and this would be repeated over and over until you left with just kids, too small and too heavily sedated in any event to possibly be able to do it on their own. And so it would be Henny's job to run those kids across in her arms, give them to a crew member who'd lower them into the arms of whoever was closest to the open hatch. And the hatches would go on board, and the crew would put as much heavy gear as possible on top of that. So if somebody did demand a search, either before it left or a Nazi patrol boat at sea, they could say, come on now, we're a government boat, we got a job to do, you're not gonna ask us to take all this stuff on. And something they actually had to do at sea more than once as they were approached by patrol boats. But he got to the point where the refugees were there, the hatches were on, all this gear was on, they could start up the engine, but they couldn't quite leave yet. There was one more step each day, and that was boarding by these two sentries. It would take at least a cursory look around, check crew ID papers. And the crew, as Henny described it, because she would be watching this all from inside the warehouse, being smart guys, knew from the start, we're all going to be better off if we could make this as friendly an encounter as possible. So they would always have a couple beers ready for the sentries, and the sentries would end up, as Henny observed it, just sitting on the edges of the hatch covers, and they and the crew would toast each other's health, who knows what, curse the weather. And all the while, the boots of these two German soldiers would be about this far above the heads of the refugees below. Finally, the dock lines could be cast off. The boat could begin its crossing. We know of two places that it took people to in Sweden. The closest was about 14 miles, the furthest about 25 miles from the dock where it began. So under optimum conditions, 2 hours up to about 3.5 hours more in rough weather, and there was rough weather at the beginning. For the first 4 or 5 days, borderline gale conditions, which in that particular stretch of water and with that particular wind direction translated into waves of about 7 to 9 feet, so it's pretty far above the rail. Inside, the boat would be rolling considerably because wind and waves would be coming broadside, and people would be inside with their backs braced against the side of the hull, both to kind of protect themselves against the motion, but also to keep them as out of sight as possible. And down below, in the dark, there would be this one encouraging sound, the sound of the engine, which I think is a part of this experience. So unlike a modern diesel that is just constant drone. This almost sounds alive. It's slow turning an engine known as a semi-diesel, 2 giant cylinders, turns at about 450 RPM, and when it's on, you just hear this kind of like pop, 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 almost like a rapid heartbeat. And down below, every one of those pops meant for them, I calculated this out once, I don't recall exactly, but another 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet further from the Nazis and closer to the salvation of Sweden. finally, they would get there, and they had to be brushed off as quickly as they possibly could because it had to get to the lighthouse while it could still explain what it was doing in terms of something that made sense in terms of its duty. And one young person in particular talked about being rushed ashore, kneeling and pretty much kissing the soil of Sweden, feeling this immense relief, turning around to thank the crew, only to see the stern of the boat passing through the breakwater, rushing off to the lighthouse. And so this went on day after day for a month until the job was done. And then Henny, her Navy cadet boyfriend, by now well on his way to being the great love of her life, these students had to decide what next. A lot of the people who were fishermen and had given up weeks or months of their season went back to earning money for their family. Others decided, no. We did this for 3.5 years. We lived in this situation of just this miserable, icy coexistence, and we did it because we were protecting not just each of us, but our fellow countrymen. We were kind of buying time at a minimum for our Jewish brethren. But now it's past that. And so what do we know now that we didn't know for those first 3.5 years? We know now that they're not invincible. That with all the power they had, we, college students, me, Henny Sindig, we could do something. We could thwart the Nazis. And we now have a group of people we know we can trust to do that. And I think big for each of those, we found out something about ourselves, that we could stand up and find out we had more courage perhaps than we imagined. And so for the next 4.5 months following the rescue, this group engaged in ever-escalating sabotage and armed resistance activities, blowing up over that period 22 major industrial sites that had been converted to war output for the Nazis. One of their raids making the New York Times in the midst of World War II. They were that significant. But they were young and they were maybe too brave. And so each success propelled them to try something larger and riskier until they attempted a simultaneous attack on 2 factories just above the German border. Piece of land where, depending on what year you were looking at, could have been Denmark, some of those years, and Germany, and others. And in the course of that, well, they did succeed in blowing up one of the factories. The other, they didn't. They could have gotten away. But a group of them decided, no, let's stay and try that one again tomorrow. In what ensued, 2 of them were killed, a couple were captured. Others, including Henny and Mix, were then sent into hiding by something called the Freedom Council, kind of an organizing board for resistance, and told to await their own evacuation orders. And they were safely evacuated to Sweden, where they immediately signed up for something called the Danish Brigade, which was kind of an army in exile, hoping to come back and it's a D-Day type operation, kick the Nazis out of their country. In the meantime, while Henny and Mix did that, Mix tried his best to marry her, and there were frequent proposals, and the response was always, well, of course I'm going to marry you, but not here, not now, when the war's over, and we're back in Denmark. Mix was an impatient kind of guy. It's one of the things that Henny liked about him. And he was patient for a while. New Year's Eve, 44, going into 45, same proposal, same response. Next day, Henny gets information from a mutual friend. Mix has left. So if he had to wait till the war was going to end, he'd do his best to end it, make at least some contribution. So got on a rowboat and rowed back to Denmark and resumed his sabotage campaign.
He rowed 14 miles.
He went further north where it was about 2.5 miles. passing board doesn't. He had previously, when the Navy base was invaded, he was on leave. He then attempted to use a sailing kayak to get to Sweden to rejoin the Navy there. That got interrupted by the storm. So if you had to row 14 miles, there was no doubt he would have given it a shot. Well, every now and then, Henny was able to get a letter from him because there was some communications through a resistance network. But it was one-way communication because when you're a saboteur in an enemy-controlled country, your letters can't have a return address. So, one-way correspondence. And the last letter in it spoke about how it's lonely, but they feel they're doing good work, he and some other person he teamed up with. And they had their day, and it will come again when this was over, and he longs to be with her again. But sadly, that was not to be. He made it almost to the end of the war, almost to his 21st birthday, but ultimately things caught up with him. The Nazis caught up with him, and he was killed. Henny went on. Took a long time to rebuild her life after that, some years. She did ultimately marry another resistance fighter, did ultimately have kids, and was able to move on. And like so many Danes, looked forward rather than back. Not much that she put on paper or any other kind of interview for quite a while, but ultimately tidbits were written down by the people who participated in this group. It was accumulated and put into some volumes, which were a good starting point for my research, something I could start with here and go to Denmark and follow up on there. So I think we need to get on board